Caramel blinked. Certainly did, he said. Gold Moon drew a deep breath. She hadn't meant the conversation to wander off, but it did lead to her subject. In a way, that's what I wanted to speak to you about. Only this has to do with Tika. Tika? Caramel flushed. She's a big girl. Begging your pardon. I don't see that what we do is any of your concern. She is a girl, Caramel. Gold Moon said gently. Don't you understand? Caramel looked blank. He knew Tika was a girl. What did Gold Moon mean? Then he blinked in sudden understanding and groaned. No, she isn't. Yes, Gold Moon sighed. She is. She's never been with a man before. She told me while we were in the grove putting on her armor. She's frightened, Caramel. She's learned a lot of stories. Don't rush her. She desperately wants approval from you, and she might do anything to win it. But don't let her use that as a reason to do something she'll regret later. If you truly love her, time will prove it and enhance the moment's sweetness. I guess you know that, huh? Chapter 10. The Royal Guard. The Chain Rule. Perhaps it was just imagination, but the darkness seemed thicker as they walked down the other tunnel, and the air grew colder. No one needed the dwarf to tell them that this was not normal decay, where the temperature supposedly stayed constant. They reached a branch in the tunnel, but no one felt inclined to go left, which might lead them back to the Hall of the Ancients and the wounded slug. The elf almost got us killed by the slug, Eben said accusingly. I wonder what's in store for us down here. No one answered. By now, everyone was experiencing the sense of growing evil Raceland had warned of. Their footsteps slowed, and it was only through force of group will that they continued on. Lorana felt fear convulse her limbs, and she clung to the wall for support. She longed for Tanis to comfort her and protect her, as he had done when they were younger and facing imaginary foes. But he walked at the head of the line with her brother. Each had his own fear to contend with. At the moment, Lorana decided that she would die before she asked for their help. It occurred to her then that she was really serious when she said she wanted to make Tanis proud of her. Shoving herself away from the side of the crumbling tunnel, she gritted her teeth and moved forward. The tunnel came to an abrupt end. Crumbled stone and rubble lay beneath a hole in the rock wall. A sense of malevolent evil flowing from the darkness beyond the hole could almost be felt, wafting across the flesh like the touch of unseen fingers. The companions stopped. None of them, not even the nerveless Kender, daring to enter. It's not that I'm afraid, Tass confided in a whisper to Flint. It's just that I'd rather be somewhere else. The silence became oppressive. Each could hear his own heartbeat and the breathing of the others. The light jittered and wavered in the mage's shaking hand. Well, we can't stay here forever, Eben said hoarsely. Let the elf go in. He's the one who brought us here. I'll go, Gilfanas answered, but I'll need light. None may touch the staff but I, Raceland hissed. He paused, then added reluctantly, I'll go with you. Raised, Caramin began, but his brother stared at him coldly. I'll go too, the big man muttered. No, Tanis said. You stay here and guard the others. Gilfanas, Raceland, and I will go. Gilphinus entered the hole in the wall, followed by the mage and Tanis, the half-elf, assisting Raceland. The light revealed a narrow chamber, vanishing into darkness beyond the staff's reach. On either side were rows of large stone doors, each held in place by huge iron hinges, spiked directly into the rock wall. Raceland held the staff high, shining it down the shadowy chamber. Each knew that the evil was centered here. There's carving on the doors, Tanis murmured. The staff's light threw the stone figures into high relief. Gilphinus stared at it. The royal crest, he said in a strangled voice. What does that mean? Tanis asked, feeling the elf's fear infect him like a plague. These are the crypts of the royal guard, Gilphinus whispered. They are pledged to continue their duties, even in death, and guard the king. So the legends speak. And so the legends come to life. Raceland breathed, gripping Tanis' arm. Tanis heard the sound of huge stone blocks shifting, of rusting iron hinges creaking. Turning his head, he saw each of the stone doors begin to swing wide. The hallway filled with a cold so severe that Tanis felt his fingers go numb. Things moved behind the stone doors. The royal guard. They made the tracks. Raceland whispered frantically. Human and not human. There is no escape, he said, grasping Tanis tighter. Unlike the spectres of dark and wood, these have but one thought, to destroy all who commit the sacrilege of disturbing the king's rest. We've got to try, Tanis said, unclenching the mage's biting fingers from his arm. He stumbled backward and reached the entryway, only to find it blocked by two figures. Get back, Tanis gasped. Run. Who, Fizban? No, you crazy old man, we've got to run. The dead guards. Oh, calm down, the old man muttered. Young people, alarmists. He turned around and helped someone else enter. It was Gold Moon, her hair gleaming in the light. It's all right, Tanis, she called softly. Look. She drew aside her cape. The medallion she wore glowed blue. Fizban said they would let us pass, Tanis. If they saw the medallion. And when he said that, it began to glow. No. Tanis started to order her back, but Fizban tapped him on the chest with a long, bony finger. You're a good man, Tanis, I told, the old maid said softly. But you worry too much. Now just relax and let us send these poor souls back to their sleep. Bring the others along, will you? Tanis, too startled for words, fell back as Gold Moon and Fizban walked past, Riverwind following. As Tanis watched, they walked slowly between the rows of gaping stone doors. Behind each stone door, movement ceased as she passed. Even at that distance, he could feel the sense of malevolent evil slip away. As the others came to the crumbling entryway, and he helped them through, he answered their whispered questions with a shrug. Lorana didn't say a word to him as she entered. Her hand was cold to the touch, and he could see, to his astonishment, blood on her lip. Knowing she must have bitten it to keep from screaming, Tanis, remorseful, started to say something to her. But the elf maid held her head high and refused to look at him. The others ran after Gold Moon hurriedly, but Tasselhoff, pausing to peek into one of the crypts, saw a tall figure dressed in resplendent armor, lying on a stone bier. Skeletal hands grasped the hilt of a longsword, lying across the body. Tass looked up at the royal crest curiously, sounding out the words. Serfin Winqua. Salario, said Tanis, coming up behind the kender.
What does it mean?
Tas asked. Faithful, beyond death, Tanis said softly. At the west end of the crypts, they found a set of bronze double doors. Gold Moon pushed it open easily and led them into a triangular passage that opened into a large hall. Inside this room, the only difficulty they faced was in trying to get the dwarf out of it. The hall was perfectly intact, the only room in the Sla Mori they had encountered so far that had survived the cataclysm without damage. And the reason for that, Flint explained to anyone who would listen, was the wonderful dwarven construction, particularly the 23 columns supporting the ceiling. The only way out was 2 identical bronze doors at the far end of the chamber, leading west. Flint, tearing himself away from the columns, examined each and grumbled that he hadn't any idea what was behind them, or where they led. After a brief discussion, Tanis decided to take the door to his right. The door opened onto a clean, narrow passageway that led them, after about 30 feet, to another single bronze door. This door, however, was locked. Karaman pushed, tugged, pried, all to no avail. It's no use, the big man grunted. It won't budge. Flint watched Karaman for several minutes, then finally stumped forward. Examining the door, he snorted and shook his head. It's a false door. Looks real to me, Karaman said, staring at the door suspiciously. It's even got hinges. Of course it does, Flint snorted. We don't build false doors to look false. Even a gully dwarf knows that. So we're at a dead end, Eben said grimly. Stand back, Raceland whispered, carefully leaning his staff against the wall. He placed both hands on the door, touching it only with the tips of his fingers, then said, Ketsara Baklio. There was a flare of orange light, but not from the door. It came from the wall. Move! Raceland grabbed his brother and jerked him back, just as the entire wall, bronze door and all, began to pivot. Quickly, before it shuts, Tanis said, and everyone hurried through the door, Karaman catching his brother as Raceland staggered. Are you all right? Karaman asked, as the wall slammed shut behind them. Yes, the weakness will pass, Raceland whispered. That is the first spell I have cast from the spellbook of Fist and Antonis. The spell of opening worked, but I did not believe it would drain me like this. The door led them into another passageway that ran straight west for about 40 feet, took a sharp turn to the south, then east, then continued south again. Here, the way was blocked by another single bronze door. Raceland shook his head. I can only use the spell once. It is gone from my memory. A fireball would open the door, said Fizban. I think I remember that spell now. No, old one, Tanis said hastily. It would fry all of us in this narrow passage. Tas. Reaching the door, the kender pushed on. Drat! It's open, he said, disappointed not to have to pick a lock. He peered inside. Just another room. They entered cautiously. Raceland, illuminating the chamber with the staff's light. The room was perfectly round, about 100 feet in diameter. Directly across from them, to the south, stood a bronze door, and in the center of the room, a crooked column, Tas said, giggling. Look, Flynn, the dwarves built a crooked column. If they did, they had a good reason, the dwarf snapped, shoving the kender aside to examine the tall, thin column. It definitely slanted. Said Flint, puzzled. Then, "It isn't a column at all, you doorknob," Flint exploded. "It's a great huge chain. Look, you can see here it hooked to an iron bracket on the floor." "Then we are in the chain room," Gilthanas said in excitement. "This is the cage defense mechanism of Paxtarchus. We must be almost in the fortress." The companions gathered around, staring at the monstrous chain in wonder. Each link was as long as Caraman was tall, and as thick around as the trunk of an oak. "What does the mechanism do?" asked Tasselhoff, longing to climb up the great chain. "Where does this lead?" "The chain leads to the mechanism itself," Gilthanas answered. "As to how it works, you must ask the dwarf, for I am unfamiliar with engineering. But if this chain is released from its moorings," he pointed to the iron bracket in the floor, "massive blocks of granite drop down behind the gates of the fortress. Then no force on Kryn can open them." Leaving the Kender to peer up into the shadowy darkness, trying in vain to get a glimpse of the wondrous mechanism, Gilthanas joined the others in searching the room. "Look at this," he finally cried, pointing to a faint door-shaped line in the stones on the north wall. "A secret door. This must be the entrance. There's a catch." Tasselhoff, turning from the chain, pointed to a chipped piece of stone at the bottom. "The dwarf slipped up," he said, grinning at Flint. "This is a false door that looks false." "And therefore not to be trusted," Flint said flatly. "Bah! Dwarves have bad days like everyone else," Eben said, bending down to try the catch. "Don't open it," Racing said suddenly. "Why not?" asked Stern. "Because you want to alert someone before we find a way into Paxtarchus?" "If I had wanted to betray you, Knight, I could have done so 1,000 times before this," Raceland hissed, staring at the secret door. "I sense a power behind that door, greater than any I have felt since." He stopped, shuddering. "Since when?" his brother prompted gently. "Towers of high sorcery," Raceland whispered. "I warn you, do not open that door." "See where the south door leads," Tanis told the dwarf. Flint stumped over to the bronze door on the south wall and shoved it open. "Near as I can tell, it leads down another passage exactly like all the others," he reported glumly. "The way to Paxtarchus is through a secret door," Gilthanas repeated. Before anyone could stop him, he reached down and pulled out the chipped stone. The door shivered and began to swing silently inward. "You will regret this," Raceland shook. The door slid aside to reveal a large room nearly filled with yellow, brick-like objects. Through a thick layer of dust, a faint yellowish color was visible. "A treasure room!" Eben cried. "We found the treasure of Kithcanon." "All in gold," Sturm said coldly. "Worthless these days, since steel's the only thing of any value." His voice trailed off. His eyes widened in horror. "What is it?" shouted Caravan, drawing his sword. "I don't know," Sturm said, more as a gasp than words. "I know." Raceland breathed as the thing took shape before his eyes. "It is the spirit of a dark elf. I warned you not to open that door." "Do something," Eben said, stumbling backward. "Put up your weapons, fools," Raceland said in a piercing whisper. "You cannot fight her. Her touch is death, and if she wails while we are within these walls, we are doomed. Her keening voice alone kills. Run, run, all of you, quickly, Through the south door! Even as they fell back, the darkness in the treasure room took shape, coalescing into the coldly beautiful, distorted features of a female drow. An evil elf of ages past, whose punishment for crimes unspeakable had been execution. Then the powerful elven magic users chained her spirit, forcing her to guard forever the king's treasure. At the sight of these living beings, she stretched out her hands, craving the warmth of flesh, and opened her mouth to scream out her grief and her hatred of all living things. The companions turned instead, stumbling over each other in their haste to escape through the bronze door. Karen fell over his brother, knocking the staff from Raceland's hand. The staff clattered on the floor, its light still glowing, for only dragonfire can destroy the magic tree. And now its light flared out over the floor, plunging the rest of the room into darkness. Seeing her prey escape, the spirit flitted into the chain room, a grasping hand brushing Eben's cheek. He screamed at the chilling, burning touch and collapsed. Sturm caught him and dragged him through the door just as Raceland grabbed his staff, and he and Caraman lunged through. "Is that everyone?" Tanis asked, reluctant to close the door. Then he heard a low, moaning sound, so frightful that he felt his heart stop beating for a moment. Fear seized him. He couldn't breathe. The cry ceased, and his heart gave a great, painful leap. The spirit sucked in its breath to scream again. "No time to look," Raceland gasped. "Shut the door, brother." Caraman threw all his weight on the bronze door. It slammed shut with a boom that echoed through the hall. "That won't stop her," Eben cried, panic-stricken. "No," said Raceland softly. "Her magic is powerful, more powerful than mine. I can cast a spell on the door, but it will weaken me greatly. I suggest you run while you can. If it fails, perhaps I can stall her." "Riverwind, take the others on ahead," Tanis ordered. "Sturm and I'll stay with Raceland and Caliban." The others crept down the dark corridor, looking back to watch in horrible fascination. Raceland ignored them and handed the staff to his brother. The light from the glowing crystal flashed out at the unfamiliar touch. The mage put his hands on the door, pressing both palms flat against it. Closing his eyes, he forced himself to forget everything, except the magic. "Kalis an Budrunin." His concentration broke as he felt a terrible chill. The dark elf. She had recognized his spell and was trying to break him. Images of his battle with another dark elf in the towers of high sorcery came back to his mind. He struggled to blot out the evil memory of the battle that wrecked his body and came close to destroying his mind. But he felt himself losing control. He had forgotten the words. The door trembled. The elf was coming through. Then, from somewhere inside the mage came a strength he had discovered within himself only twice before. In the tower, and on the altar of the Black Dragon in Zak Sorrow. The familiar voice that he could hear clearly in his mind, yet never identify, spoke to him, repeating the words of the spell. Raceland shouted them aloud in a strong, clear voice that was not his own. "Kalisan Budrunin, Kara Emara." From the other side of the door came a wail of disappointment, failure.
Give me 1 second again, everyone.
The mage collapsed. Caraman handed the staff to Eben as he picked up his brother in his arms and followed the others as they groped their way along the dark passage. Another secret door opened easily to Flint's hand, leading to a series of short, debris-filled tunnels. Trembling with fear, The companions wearily made their way past these obstacles. Finally, they emerged into a large, open room filled from ceiling to floor with stacks of wooden crates. Riverwind lit the torch on the wall. The crates were nailed shut. Some bore the label Solace. Some Gateway. This is it. We're inside the fortress, Gilthanas said, grimly victorious. We stand in the cellar of Pax Tharkus. Thank the true gods. Tanis sighed and sank onto the floor, the others slumping down beside him. It was then they noticed that Fizban and Tasselhoff were missing. Chapter 11. Lost. The plan. Betrayed. Tasselhoff could never afterward clearly recall those last few panicked moments in the chain room. He remembered saying, "A dark elf," and standing on his tiptoes, trying desperately to see, when suddenly the glowing staff fell on the floor. He heard Tanis shouting, and above that, a kind of moaning sound that made the Kender lose all sense of where he was or what he was doing. Then strong hands grabbed him around the waist, lifting him up into the air. "Climb!" shouted a voice beneath him. Tasselhoff stretched out his hands, felt the cool metal of the chain, and began to climb. He heard a door boom far below, and the chilling wail of the dark elf again. It didn't sound deadly this time, more like a cry of rage and anger. Taz hoped this meant his friends had escaped. "I wonder how I'll find them again," he asked himself softly, feeling discouraged for a moment. Then he heard Fizban muttering to himself and cheered up. He wasn't alone. Thick, heavy darkness wrapped around the Kender. Climbing by feel alone, he was growing extremely tired when he felt cool air brush his right cheek. He sensed, rather than saw, that he must be coming to the place where the chain and the mechanism linked up. Taz was rather proud of that thought. If only he could see. Then he remembered. He was, after all, with a magician. "We could use a light," Taz called out. "A fight? Where?" Fizban nearly lost his grip on the chain. "Not fight, light," Taz said patiently, clinging to a link. "I think we're near the top of this thing and we really ought to have a look around." "Oh, certainly. Let's see. Light." He heard the magician fumbling in his pouches. Apparently, he found what he was searching for because he soon gave a little crow of triumph, spoke a few words, and a small puffball of bluish-yellow flame appeared, hovering near the magician's hat. The glowing puffball whizzed up, danced around Tasselhoff as if to inspect the Kender, then returned to the proud magician. Taz was enchanted. He had all sorts of questions regarding the wonderful flaming puffball, but his arms were getting shaky and the old magician was nearly done in. He knew they had better find some way to get off this chain. Looking up, he saw that they were, as he had guessed, at the top part of the fortress. The chain ran up over a huge wooden cogwheel mounted on an iron axle, anchored in solid stone. The links of the chain fit over teeth big as tree trunks. Then the chain stretched out across the wide shaft, disappearing into a tunnel to the Kender's right. "We can climb onto that gear and crawl along the chain in the tunnel," the Kender said, thinking. "Can you send the light up here?" "Light to the wheel," Fizban instructed. The light wavered in the air for a moment, then danced back and forth in a decidedly naysaying manner. Fizban frowned. "Light to the wheel," he repeated firmly. The puffball flame darted around to hide behind the magician's hat. His grabbed it, and flung forward down the chain. The puffball danced in the air behind him as if enjoying the game. I guess we've got enough light after all, Tass said. The younger generation, Fizban grumbled. His father, now there was a puffball. The old magician's voice died away as he began to climb again, the puffball flame hovering near the tip of his battered hat. Tass soon reached the first tooth on the wheel. Discovering the teeth were rough-hewn and easy to climb, Tass crawled from one to another until he reached the top. Fizban, his legs hiked up around the top and followed with amazing agility. Could you ask the light to shine in the tunnel? Tass asked. Light, to the tunnel, Fizban ordered. Wrapped around a leg. The puffball appeared to consider the command. Slowly, it skittered to the edge of the tunnel, then stopped. Inside the tunnel, the magician commanded. The puffball flame refused. I think it's afraid of the dark, Fizban said apologetically. My goodness, how remarkable, Fizban said in astonishment. Well, he thought for a moment. If it will stay where it is, I think I can see enough to make my way across the chain. It looks like it's only about 15 feet or so to the tunnel. With nothing below but several hundred feet of darkness and air. Never mind the stone floor at the bottom, Tass thought. Someone should come up here and grease this thing, Fizban said, examining the axle critically. That's all you get today, shoddy workmanship. I'm really rather glad they didn't, Tass said mildly, crawling forward onto the chain. About halfway across the gap, the kender considered what it would be like to fall from this height, tumbling down and down and down, then hitting the stone floor at the bottom. He wondered what it would feel like to splatter all over the floor. Get a move on, Fizban shouted, crawling out onto the chain after the kender. Tass crawled forward quickly to the tunnel entrance, where the puffball flame waited, then jumped off the chain onto the stone floor about 5 feet below him. The puffball flame darted in after him, and finally, Fizban reached the tunnel entrance too. At the last moment he fell, but Tass caught hold of his robes and dragged the old man to safety. They were sitting on the floor, resting, when the old man's head snapped up. My stuff, he said. What about it? Tass yawned, wondering what time it was. The old man struggled to his feet. Left it down below, he mumbled, heading for the chain. Wait! You can't go back. Tasselhoff jumped up and alarmed. What did you say? Asked the old man petulantly, his beard bristling. I didn't mean... Tass stuttered. It would be dangerous. But I know how you feel. My hoopak's down there. Fizban said, sitting back down disconsolately. Was it magic? Tass asked after a moment. I was never quite certain, Fizban said wistfully. Well, said Tass practically. Maybe after we finish the adventure, we can go back and get it. Now let's try to find some place to rest. He glanced around the tunnel. It was about 7 feet from floor to ceiling. The huge chain ran along the top with numerous smaller chains attached, stretching across the tunnel floor into a vast, dark pit beyond. Tass, staring down into it, could vaguely make out the shape of gigantic boulders. What time do you suppose it is? Tass asked. Lunchtime, said the old man. And we might as well rest right here. It's as safe a place as any. He plopped back down, pulling out a handful of quith power. He began to chew on it noisily. The puffball flame wandered over and settled on the brim of the magician's hat. Tas sat down next to the mage and began to nibble on his own bit of dried fruit. Then he sniffed. There was suddenly a very peculiar smell, like someone burning old socks. Looking up, he sighed and tugged on the magician's robe. Fizban, he said, your hat's on fire. Flint, Tanis said sternly. For the last time, I feel as badly as you do about losing Tas, but we cannot go back. He's with Fizban, and knowing those two, they'll both manage to get out of whatever predicament they're in. If they don't bring all Fortress down around our ears, Sturm muttered. The dwarf wiped his hand across his eyes, glared at Tanis, then whirled on his feet and stumped back to a corner where he hurled himself onto the floor, sulking. Tanis sat back down. He knew how Flint felt. It seemed odd. There'd been so many times he could happily have strangled Vikander, but now that he was gone, Tanis missed him. And for exactly the same reasons. There was an innate, unfailing cheerfulness about Tasselhoff that made him an invaluable companion. No danger ever frightened Vikander, and therefore Tas never gave up. He was never at a loss for something to do in an emergency. It might not always be the right thing, but at least he was ready to act. Tanis smiled sadly. I only hope this emergency doesn't prove to be his last, he thought. The companions rested for an hour, eating quiff pa and drinking fresh water from a deep well they discovered. Raceland regained consciousness but could eat nothing. He sipped water, then lay limply back. Karaman broke the news to him about Fizban hesitantly, fearing his brother might take the old mage's disappearance badly. But Raceland simply shrugged, closed his eyes, and sank into a deep sleep. After Tanis felt his strength return, he rose and walked toward Gilthanas, noting that the elf was intently studying the map. Passing Lorana, who sat alone, he smiled at her. She refused to acknowledge it. Tanis sighed. Already he regretted speaking harshly to her back in the Slamori. He had to admit that she had handled herself remarkably well under terrifying circumstances. She had done what she was told to, quickly and without question. Tanis supposed he would have to apologize. But first he needed to talk to Gilthanas. What's the plan? He asked, sitting down on a crate. Yes, where are we? Sturm asked. Soon almost everyone was crowded around the map except Raceland, who appeared to sleep, though Tanis thought he saw a slit of gold shining through the mage's supposedly closed eyelids. Gilthanas spread his map flat. Here is the fortress of Pax Darkus and the surrounding mine area, he said. Then he pointed. We are in the cellars, here on the lowest level. Down this hallway, about 50 feet from here, are the rooms where the women are imprisoned. This is a guard room, across from the women, and this, he tapped the map gently, is the lair of one of the red dragons, the one Lord Verminard called Ember. The dragon is so big, of course, that the lair extends up above ground level, communicating with Lord Verminard's chambers on the first floor, up through the gallery on the second floor, and out into the open sky. Gilthanas smiled bitterly. On the first floor, behind Verminard's chambers, is the prison where the children are kept. The Dragon High Lord is wise. He keeps the hostages separated, knowing that the women would never consider leaving without their children, and the men would not leave without their families. The children are guarded by a second red dragon in the The men, about 300 of them, work in mines out in the mountain caves. There are several hundred gully dwarves working the mines as well. You seem to know a lot about Pax Tharkus, Eben said. Gilthanus glanced up quickly. What do you insinuate? I'm not insinuating anything, Eben answered. It's just that you know a lot about this place for never having been here. And wasn't it interesting that we kept running into creatures who damn near killed us back in the Slaumori? Eben. Tanis spoke very quietly. We've had enough of your suspicions. I don't believe any of us is a traitor. As Raceland said, the traitor could have betrayed any of us long before this. What's the point of coming this far? To bring me and the discs to Lord Verminard, Gold Moon said softly. He knows I am here, Tanis. He and I are linked by our faith. That's ridiculous, Sturm snorted. No, it isn't, Gold Moon said. Remember, there are 2 constellations missing. One was the Queen of Darkness. From what little I've been able to understand, in the discs of Mishikal, the Queen was also one of the ancient gods. The gods of good are matched by the gods of evil, with the gods of neutrality striving to keep the balance. Hermenard worships the Queen of Darkness as I worship Mishikal. That is what Mishikal meant when she said we were to restore the balance. The promise of good that I bring is the one thing he fears, and he is exerting all his will to find me. The longer I stay here... Her voice died. All the more reason to quit bickering, Tanis stated, switching his gaze to Eben. The fighter shrugged. Enough said. I'm with you. What is your plan, Gilthanus? Tanis asked, noticing with irritation that Sturm and Karaman and Eben exchanged quick glances, 3 humans sticking together against the elves. He caught himself thinking. But perhaps I'm just as bad, believing in Gilthanus because he's an elf. Gilthanus saw the exchange of glances too. For a moment he stared at them with an intense, unblinking gaze, then began to speak in a measured tone, considering his words, as if reluctant to reveal any more than was absolutely necessary. Every evening, 10 to 12 women are allowed to leave their cells and take food to the men in the mines. Thus, the High Lord lets the men see that he is keeping his side of the bargain. The women are allowed to visit the children once a day for the same reason. My warriors and I planned to disguise ourselves as women, go out to the men in the mines, tell them of the plan to free the hostages, and alert them to be ready to strike. Beyond that, we had not thought, particularly in regard to freeing the children. Our spies indicated something strange about the dragon guarding the children, but we could not determine what. What's Karaman started to ask, caught Tanis's eye and thought better of his question. Instead, he asked, when will we strike? And what about the dragon, Ember? We strike tomorrow morning. Lord Verminard and Ember will most certainly join the army tomorrow as it reaches the outskirts of Coronasti. He has been preparing for this invasion a long time. I do not believe he will miss it. The group discussed the plan for several minutes, adding to it, refining it, generally agreeing that it appeared viable. They gathered their things as Karaman woke his brother. Sturm and Eben pushed open the door leading to the hallway. It appeared empty, although they could hear faint sounds of harsh, drunken laughter from a room directly across from them. Draconians. Silently, the companions slipped into the dark, dingy corridor. Tasselhoff stood in the middle of what he had named the mechanism room, staring around the tunnel lighted dimly by the puffball. the Kender was beginning to feel discouraged. It was a feeling he didn't get often, and likened to the time he'd eaten an entire green tomato pie acquired from a neighbor. To this day, discouragement and green tomato pie both made him want to throw up. "There's got to be some way out of here," said the Kender. "Surely they inspect the mechanism occasionally, or come up to admire it, or give tours or something." He and Fizban had spent an hour walking up and down the tunnel, crawling in and out among the myriad chains. They found nothing. It was cold and barren, and covered with dust. "Speaking of light," said the old magician suddenly, though they hadn't been. "Look there." Tasselhoff looked. A thin sliver of light was visible through a crack in the bottom of the wall, near the entrance to the narrow tunnel. They could hear voices, and the light grew brighter as if torches were being lit in a room below them. "Maybe that's the way out," the old man said. Running lightly down the tunnel, Tass knelt and peered through the crack. "Come here." The two looked down into a large room, furnished with every possible luxury. All that was beautiful, graceful, delicate, or valuable in the lands under Verminard's control had been brought to decorate the private chambers of the Dragon High Lord. An ornate throne stood at one end of the room. Rare and priceless silver mirrors hung on the walls, arranged so cunningly that no matter where a trembling captive turned, the only image he saw was the grotesque, horned helm of the Dragon High Lord glowering at him. "That must be him," Tass whispered to Fizban. "That must be Lord Verminard." The Kender sucked in his breath in awe. "That must be his dragon. Ember, the one Gilthanas told us about, that killed all the elves in Solace." Ember, or Pyros, his true name being a secret known only to Draconians or to other dragons, never to common mortals, was an ancient and enormous red dragon. Pyros had been given to Lord Verminard, ostensibly as a reward from the Queen of Darkness to her cleric. In reality, Pyros was sent to keep a watchful eye on Verminard, who had developed a strange, paranoid fear regarding discovery of the true gods. All the Dragon High Lords on Krynn possessed dragons, however, though perhaps not as strong and intelligent. For Pyros had another, more important mission that was secret, even to the Dragon High Lord himself, a mission assigned to him by the Queen of Darkness and known only to her and her evil dragons. Pyros' mission was to search this part of Anselin for one man, a man of many names. The Queen of Darkness called him Everman. The dragons called him Green Gemstone Man. His human name was Beram. And it was because of this unceasing search for the human Beram that Pyros was present in Verminard's chamber this afternoon, when he would have much preferred to be napping in his lair. Pyros had received word that Viewmaster Turda was bringing in 2 prisoners for interrogation. There was always the possibility this Beram might be one of them. Therefore, the dragon was always present during interrogations, though he often appeared mostly bored. The only time interrogations became interesting, as far as Pyros was concerned, was when Verminard ordered a prisoner to feed the dragon. Pyros was stretched out along one side of the enormous throne room, completely filling it. His huge wings were folded at his sides, his flanks heaved with every breath he took, like some great gnomish engine. Dozing, he snorted and shifted slightly. A rare vase toppled to the floor with a crash. Verminard looked up from his desk, where he was studying a map of Qualinesti. Transform yourself before you wreck the place, he snarled. Pyros opened one eye, regarded Verminard coldly for a moment, then grudgingly rumbled a brief word of magic. The gigantic red dragon began to shimmer like a mirage, the monstrous dragon shape condensing into the shape of a human male, slight of build with dark black hair, a thin face, and slanting red eyes. Dressed in crimson robes, Pyros, the man, walked to a desk near Verminard's throne. Sitting down, he folded his hands and stared at Verminard's broad, muscled back with undisguised loathing. There was a scratch at the door. "Enter," Verminard commanded absently. A draconian guard threw open the door, admitting Viewmaster Turda and his prisoners, then withdrew, swinging the great bronze and gold doors shut. Verminard kept the Viewmaster waiting several long minutes while he continued to study his battle plan. Then, favoring Turda with a condescending gaze, he walked over and ascended the steps to his throne. It was elaborately carved to resemble the gaping jaws of a dragon. Verminard was an imposing figure. Powerfully built, he wore dark, dragon-scale armor trimmed in gold. The hideous mask of a dragon high lord concealed his face, moving with a grace remarkable in such a large man. He leaned back comfortably, his leather-encased hand absently caressing a black, gold-trimmed mace by his side. Verminard regarded Turda and his two captives irritably, knowing full well that Turda had dredged up these two in an effort to redeem himself from the disastrous loss of the cleric. When Verminard discovered from his Draconians that a woman matching the description of the cleric had been among those prisoners taken from Solace, and that she had been allowed to escape, his fury was terrifying. Turda had nearly paid for his mistake with his life, but the goblin was exceptionally skilled at whining and groveling. Knowing this, Verminard had considered refusing to admit Turda at all today, but he had a strange, nagging sensation that all was not well in his realm. "It's that blasted cleric," Verminard thought. He could sense her power coming nearer and nearer, making him nervous and uneasy. He intently studied the two prisoners. Turda led into the room. Then, seeing that neither of them matched the descriptions of those who had raided Zaktsaroth, Verminard scowled behind the mask. Pyros reacted differently to the sight of the prisoners. The transformed dragon half rose to his feet while his thin hands clenched the ebony desktop with such ferocity he left the impressions of his fingers in the wood. Shaking with excitement, it took a great effort of will to force himself to sit back down. Outwardly calm. Only his eyes, burning with a devouring flame, gave a hint of his inner elation as he stared at the prisoners. One of the prisoners was a gully dwarf, Seston, in fact. He was chained, hand and foot. Turda was taking no chances, and could barely walk. Stumbling forward, he dropped to his knees before the Dragon High Lord, terror-stricken. The other prisoner, the one Pyros watched, was a human male, dressed in rags, who stood staring at the floor. "Why have you bothered me with these wretches, Viewmaster?" Verminard snarled. Turda, reduced to a quivering mass, gulped and immediately launched into his speech. "This prisoner," the hobgoblin kicked Seston, "was the one who freed the slaves from Solace. And this prisoner," he indicated the man, who lifted his head, a confused and puzzled expression on his face, was found wandering around Gateway, which, as you know, has been declared off limits to all non-military personnel. So why bring them to me? Asked Lord Verminard irritably. Throw them into the mines with the rest of the rabble. Turda stammered. I thought the human might be a spy. The Dragon High Lord studied the human intently. He was tall, about 50 human years old. His hair was white, and his clean-shaven face brown and weathered, streaked with lines of age. He was dressed like a beggar, which is probably what he was, Verminard thought in disgust. There was certainly nothing unusual about him, except for his eyes, which were bright and young. His hands, too, were those of a man in his prime, probably elven blood. The man is feeble-minded, Verminard said finally. Look at him, gaping like a landed fish. I believe he's, deaf and dumb, my lord, Turda said, sweating. Verminard wrinkled his nose. Not even the dragon helm could keep away the foul odor of perspiring hobgoblin. So you have captured a gully dwarf and a spy who can neither hear nor speak, Verminard said caustically. Well done, Turda. Perhaps now you can go out and pick me a bouquet of flowers. If that is your lordship's pleasure, Turda replied, solemnly, bowing. Verminard began to laugh beneath his helm, amused in spite of himself. Turda was such an entertaining little creature. A pity he couldn't be taught to bathe. Verminard waved his hand. Remove them. And yourself. What shall I do with the prisoners, my lord? Have that gully dwarf feed Ember tonight, and take your spy to the mines. Keep a watch on him, though. He looks deadly. The Dragon High Lord laughed. Pyros ground his teeth and cursed Verminard for a fool. Turda bowed again. Come on, you, he snarled, yanking on the manacles, and the man stumbled after him. You too! He prodded Seston with his foot. It was useless. The gully dwarf, hearing he was to feed the dragon, had fainted. A Draconian was called to remove him. Verminard left his throne and walked over to his desk. He gathered up his maps in a great roll. Send the Wyvern with dispatches, he ordered Pyros. We fly tomorrow morning to destroy Qualinesti. Be ready when I call. When the bronze and golden doors had closed behind the Dragon High Lord, Pyros, still in human form, rose from the desk and began to pace feverishly back and forth across the room. There came a scratching at the door. Lord Verminard has gone to his chambers, Pyros called out, irritated at the interruption. The door opened a crack. It is you I wish to see, Royal One, whispered a Draconian. Enter, Pyros said, but be swift. The traitor has been successful, Royal One, the Draconian said softly. He was able to slip away only for a moment, lest they suspect. But he has brought the cleric. To the abyss with the cleric, Pyros snarled. This news is of interest only to Verminard. Take it to him. Don't wait. The dragon paused. As you instructed, I came to you first, the Draconian said apologetically, preparing to make a hasty departure. Don't go, the dragon ordered, raising a hand. This news is of value to me after all. Not the cleric. There is much more at stake. I must meet with our treacherous friend. Bring him to me tonight in my lair. Do not inform Lord Verminard. Not yet. He might meddle. Pyros was thinking rapidly now, his plans coming together. Verminard has Qualaneste to keep him occupied. As the Draconian bowed and left the throne room, Pyros began pacing once again, back and forth, rubbing his hands together, smiling. Chapter 12. The Parable of the Gem. Traitor revealed. Tass's dilemma. Stop that, you boy! Caraman simpered, slapping Eben's hand as the fighter slyly slid his hand up Caraman's skirt. The women in the room laughed so heartily at the antics of the two warriors that Tanis glanced nervously at the cell door, afraid of arousing the suspicion of the guards. Marita saw his worried gaze. Don't worry about the guards, she said with a shrug. There are only 2 down here on this level, and they're drunk half the time, especially now that the army's moved out. She looked up from her sewing at the women and shook her head. It does my heart good to hear them laugh, poor things, she said softly. They've had little enough to laugh about these past days. 34 women were crowded into one cell. Marita said there were 60 women living in another nearby, under conditions so shocking that even the hardened campaigners were appalled. Rude straw mats covered the floor. The women had no possessions beyond a few clothes. They were allowed outdoors for a brief exercise period each morning. The rest of the time, they were forced to sew Draconian uniforms. Though they had been imprisoned only a few weeks, their faces were pale and wan, their bodies thin and gaunt from the lack of nourishing food. Tanis relaxed. Though he had known Marita only a few hours, he already relied on her judgment. She was the one who calmed the terrified women when the companions burst into their cell. She was the one who listened to their plan and agreed that it had possibilities. Our menfolk will go along with you, she told Tanis. It's the High Seekers who will give you trouble. The Council of High Seekers? Tanis asked in astonishment. They're here? Prisoners? Marita nodded, frowning. That was their payment for believing in that black cleric. But they won't want to leave. And why should they? They're not forced to work in the mines. The Dragon High Lord sees to that. But we're with you. She glanced around at the others, who nodded firmly. On one condition, that you'll not put the children in danger. I can't guarantee that, Tanis said. I don't mean to sound harsh, but we may have to fight a dragon to reach them, and... Fight a dragon? Flame strike? Marita looked at him in amazement. Ah, there's no need to fight the pitiful critter. In fact, were you to hurt her, you'd have half the children ready to tear you apart. They're that fond of her. Of a dragon? Gold Moon asked. What's she done? Cast a spell on them? No. I doubt Flamestrike could cast a spell on anything anymore. Marita smiled sadly. The poor critter's more than half mad. Her own children were killed in some great war or other, and now she's got it in her head that our children are her children. Don't know where his lordship dug her up, but it was a sorry thing to do, and I hope he pays for it someday. She snapped the thread viciously. It won't be difficult to free the children, she added, seeing Tanis's worried look. Flamestrike always sleeps late of a morning. We feed the children their breakfast, take them out for their exercise, and she never stirs. She'll never know they're gone till she wakes, poor thing. The women, filled with hope for the first time, began modifying old clothes to fit the men. Things went smoothly until it came time to fit them. Shave! Sturm roared in such fury that the women scurried away from the knight in alarm. Sturm had taken a dim view of the disguise idea anyway, but had agreed to go along with it. It seemed the best way to cross the wide-open courtyard between the fortress and the mines. But, he announced, he would rather die 100 deaths at the hands of the Dragon High Lord than shave his mustaches. He only calmed down when Tanis suggested covering his face with a scarf. Just when that was settled, another crisis arose. Riverwind stated flatly that he would not dress up as a woman, and no amount of arguing could convince him otherwise. Goldmoon finally took Tanis aside to explain that in their tribe, any warrior who committed a cowardly act in battle was forced to wear women's clothes until he redeemed himself. Tanis was baffled by this one, but Marita had wondered how they would manage to outfit the tall man anyway. After much discussion, it was decided Riverwind would bundle up in a long cloak and walk hunched over, leaning on a staff like an old woman. Things went smoothly after this, for a time at least. Lorana walked over to a corner of the room where Tanis was wrapping a scarf around his own face. "Why don't you shave?" Lorana asked, staring at Tanis's beard. "Or do you truly enjoy flaunting your human side, as Gilthanas says?" "I don't flaunt it," Tanis replied evenly. "I just got tired of trying to deny it. That's all." He drew a deep breath. "Lorana, I'm sorry I spoke to you as I did back in the Slough Mori. I had no right." "You had every right," Lorana interrupted. "What I did was the act of a lovesick girl. I foolishly endangered your lives." Her voice faltered. Then she regained control. "It will not happen again. I will prove I can be of value to the group." Exactly how she meant to do this, she wasn't certain. Although she talked glibly about being skilled in fighting, she had never killed so much as a rabbit. She was so frightened now that she was forced to clasp her hands behind her back to keep Tanis from seeing how she trembled. She was afraid that if she let herself, she would give way to her weakness and seek comfort in his arms. So she left him and went over to help Gilthanas with his disguise. Tanis told himself he was glad Lorana was showing some signs of maturity at last. He steadfastly refused to admit that his soul stood breathless whenever he looked into her large, luminous eyes. The afternoon passed swiftly, and soon it was evening and time for the women to take dinner to the mines. The companions waited for the guards in tense silence, laughter forgotten. There had, after all, been one last crisis. Raceland, coughing until he was exhausted, said he was too weak to accompany them. When his brother offered to stay behind with him, Raceland glared at him irritably and told him not to be a fool. "You do not need me this night," the mage whispered. "Leave me alone. I must sleep." "I don't like leaving him here," Gilthanas began, but before he could continue, they heard the sound of clawed feet outside the cell, and another sound of pots rattling. The cell door swung open, and two Draconian guards, both smelling strongly of stale wine, stepped inside. One of them reeled a bit as it peered, bleary-eyed, at the women. "Get moving," it said harshly. As the women filed out, they saw 6 gully dwarves standing in the corridor, lugging large pots of some sort of nameless stew. Caraman sniffed hungrily, then wrinkled his nose in disgust. The Draconians slammed the cell door shut behind them. Glancing back, Caraman saw his twin, shrouded in blankets, lying in a dark, shadowy corner. Fizban clapped his hands. "Well done, my boy," said the old magician in excitement, as part of the wall in the mechanism room swung open. "Thanks," Tass replied modestly. "Actually, finding the secret door was more difficult than opening it. I don't know how you managed. I thought I'd looked everywhere." He started to crawl through the door, then stopped, as a thought occurred to him. Fizban, is there any way you can tell that light of yours to stay behind? At least until we see if anyone's in here? Otherwise, I'm going to make an awfully good target, and we're not far from Verminard's chambers.
I'm afraid not.
Fizban shook his head.
He doesn't like to be left alone in dark places.
Tasselhoff nodded. He had expected the answer. Well, there was no use worrying about it. If the milk's spilled, the cat will drink it, as his mother used to say. Fortunately, the narrow hallway he crawled into appeared empty. The flame hovered near his shoulder. He helped Fizban through, then explored his surroundings. They were in a small hallway that ended abruptly not 40 feet away in a flight of stairs descending into darkness. Double bronze doors in the east wall provided the only other exit. Now, muttered Tass, we are above the throne room. Those stairs probably lead down to it. I suppose there's a million Draconians guarding it, so that's out. He put his ear to the door. No sound. Let's look around. Pushing gently, he easily opened the double doors. Pausing to listen, Tass entered cautiously, followed closely by Fizban and the puffball flame. Some sort of art gallery, he said, glancing around a giant room where paintings, covered with dust and grime, hung on the walls. High slit windows in the walls gave Tass a glimpse of the stars and the tops of high mountains. With a good idea of where he was now, he drew a crude map in his hand. If my calculations are correct, the throne room is to the west, and the dragon's lair is to the west of that. At least that's where we went when Verminard left this afternoon. The dragon must have some way to fly out of this building, so the lair should open up into the sky, which means a shaft of some sort, and maybe another crack where we can see what's going on. So involved was Tass with his plans that he was not paying attention to Fizban. The old magician was moving purposefully around the room, studying each painting as if searching for one in particular.
Ah, here it is,
Fizban murmured, then turned and whispered,
Tasselhoff.
The Kender lifted his head and saw the painting suddenly begin to glow with a soft light. Look at that, Tasselhoff said, entranced. Why, it's a painting of dragons. Red dragons like Ember, attacking Pax Tharkus, and... The Kender's voice died. Men, knights of Solamnia, mounted on other dragons, were fighting back. The dragons the knights rode were beautiful dragons, gold and silver dragons, and the men carried bright weapons that gleamed with a shining radiance. Suddenly, Tasselhoff understood. There were good dragons in the world, if they could be found, who would help fight the evil dragons, and there was the Dragonlance, he murmured. The old magician nodded to himself.
Yes, little one,
he whispered.
You understand. You see the answer, and you will remember. But not now. Not now.
Reaching out, he ruffled the Kender's hair with his gnarled hand. Dragons. What was I saying? Tass couldn't remember. And what was he doing here anyhow, staring at a painting so covered with dust he couldn't make it out? The Kender shook his head. Fizban must be rubbing off on him. Oh, yes, the dragon's lair. If my calculations are correct, it's over here. He walked away. The old magician shuffled along behind, smiling. The companions' journey to the mines proved uneventful. They saw only a few Draconian guards, and they appeared half asleep with boredom. No one paid any attention to the women going by. They passed the glowing forge, continually fed by a scrambling mass of exhausted gully dwarves. Hurrying past that dismal sight quickly, The companions entered the mines where Draconian guards locked the men in huge cave rooms at night, then returned to keep an eye on the gully dwarves. Guard duty over the men was a waste of time anyway, Verminard figured. The humans weren't going anyplace. And, for a while, it looked to Tanis as if this might prove horribly true. The men weren't going anyplace. They stared at Gold Moon, unconvinced, as she spoke. After all, she was a barbarian. Her accent was strange, her dress even stranger. She told what seemed a children's tale of a dragon dying in a blue flame she herself survived. And all she had to show for it was a collection of shining platinum discs. Hedrick, the Solace theocrat, was loud in his denunciation of the Quayshu woman as a witch and a charlatan and a blasphemer. He reminded them of the scene in the inn, exhibiting his scarred hand as evidence. Not that the men paid a great deal of attention to Hedrick. The Seeker gods, after all, had not kept the dragons from Solace. Many of them, in fact, were interested in the prospect of escape. Nearly all bore some mark of ill treatment, whiplashes, bruised faces. They were poorly fed, forced to live in conditions of filth and squalor. And everyone knew that when the iron beneath the hills was gone, their usefulness to Lord Verminard would end. But the High Seekers, still the governing body even in prison, opposed such a reckless plan. Arguments started. The men shouted back and forth. Tanis hastily posted Caraman, Flint, Eben, Sturm, and Gilphanas at the doors, fearing the guards would hear the disturbance and return. The half-elf hadn't expected this. The arguing might last for days. Goldmoon sat despondently before the men, looking as though she might cry. She had been so imbued with her newfound convictions, and so eager to bring her knowledge to the world, that she was cast into despair when her beliefs were doubted. "These humans are fools," Lorana said softly, coming up to stand beside Tanis. "No," replied Tanis, sighing. "If they were fools, it would be easier. We promise them nothing tangible and ask them to risk the only thing they have left. Their lives. And for what? To flee into the hills, fighting a running battle all the way. At least here they are alive. For the time being. But how can life be worth anything living like this?" Lorana asked. "That's a very good question, young woman," said a feeble voice. They turned to see Marita kneeling beside a man lying on a crude cot in a corner of the cell. Wasted with illness and deprivation, his age was indeterminable. He struggled to sit up, stretching out a thin, pale hand to Tanis and Lorana. His breath rattled in his chest. Marita tried to hush him, but he stared at her irritably. "I know I'm dying, woman. Doesn't mean I have to be bored to death first. Bring that barbarian woman over to me." Tanis looked at Marita questioningly. She rose and came over, drawing him to one side. "He is Alistair," she said, as if Tanis should know the name. When Tanis didn't respond, she clarified. "Alistair, one of the High Seekers from Haven. He was much loved and respected by the people. The only one who spoke out against this Lord Verminard, but no one listened. Not wanting to hear, of course." "You speak of him in the past tense," Tanis said. "He isn't dead yet." "No, but it won't be long." Marita wiped away a tear. "I've seen the wasting sickness before. My own father died of it. There's something inside of him, eating him alive. These last few days he has been half mad with the pain, but that's gone now. The end is very near." "Maybe not," Tanis smiled. "Goldmoon is a cleric. She can heal him." "Perhaps. Perhaps not," Marita said skeptically. I wouldn't want to chance it. We shouldn't excite Elistan with false hope. Let him die in peace. Gold Moon, Tanis said as the chieftain's daughter came near. This man wants to meet you. Ignoring Marita, the half-elf led Gold Moon over to Elistan. Gold Moon's face, hard and cold with disappointment and frustration, softened as she saw the man's pitiful condition. Elistan looked up at her.
Young woman,
He said sternly, though his voice was weak.
you claim to bring word from ancient gods. If it truly was we humans who turned from them, not the gods who turned from us as we've always thought, then why have they waited so long to make their presence known?
Gold Moon knelt down beside the dying man, in silence, thinking how to phrase her answer. Finally, she said, Imagine you are walking through a wood, carrying your most precious possession, a rare and beautiful gem. Suddenly, you are attacked by a vicious beast. You drop the gem and run away. When you realize the gem is lost, you are afraid to go back into the woods and search for it. Then, someone comes along with another gem. Deep in your heart, you know it is not as valuable as the one you lost. You are still too frightened to go back to look for the other. Now, does this mean the gem has left the forest? Or is it still lying there, shining brightly beneath the leaves, waiting for you to return? Elistan closed his eyes, sighing, his face filled with anguish.
Of course, the gem waits for our return. What fools we have been. I wish I had time to learn of your gods,
he said, reaching out his hand. Gold Moon caught her breath, her face drained until she was nearly as pale as the dying man on the cot. You will be given time, she said softly, taking his hand in hers. Tanis, absorbed in the drama before him, started in alarm when he felt a touch on his arm. He turned around, his hand on his sword, to find Sturm and Karam standing behind him.
What is it?
He asked swiftly. The gods?
Not yet,
Sturm said harshly.
but we can expect them any minute. Both Eben and Gilthanas are gone.
Night deepened over Pax Tharkas. Back in his lair, the red dragon Pyros had no room to pace, a habit he had fallen into in his human form. He barely had room to spread his wings in this chamber, though it was the largest in the fortress and had even been expanded to accommodate him. But the ground floor chamber was so narrow, all the dragon could do was turn his great body around. Forcing himself to relax, the dragon laid down upon the floor and waited, his eyes on the door. He didn't notice two heads peeking over the railing of a balcony on the third level far above him. There was a scratch on the door. Pyros raised his head in eager anticipation, then dropped it again with a snarl as two goblins appeared, dragging between them a wretched specimen.
Golly, dwarf,
Pyros sneered, speaking common to underlings.
Verminard's taken leave of his senses, and he thinks I'd eat Gully Dwarf. Toss him in a corner and get out.
He snarled at the goblins, who hastened to do as instructed. Seston cowered in the corner, whimpering.
Shut up.
Pyros ordered irritably.
Perhaps I should just flame you and stop that blubbering.
There came another sound at the door, a soft knocking the dragon recognized. His eyes burned red.
Enter!
A figure came into the lair of the dragon, dressed in a long cloak. A hood covered its face.
I have come as you commanded, Ember,
the figure said softly.
Yes,
Pyros replied, his talons scratching the floor.
remove the hood. I would see the faces of those I deal with.
The man cast his hood back. Up above the dragon on the third level came a strangled, choking gasp. Pyros stared up at the darkened balcony. He considered flying up to investigate, but the figure interrupted his thought.
I have only limited time, Royal One. I must return before they suspect, and I should report to Lord Verminard in due course.
Pyros snapped irritably.
What are these fools that you accompany plotting? They plan to free the slaves and lead them in revolt, forcing Verminard to recall the army marching on Qualinesti. That's all?
Yes, Royal One. Now we must warn the Dragon High Lord.
Bah! What does that matter? It will be I who deal with the slaves if they revolt, unless they have plans for me.
No, Royal One.
They fear you a great deal, as all must.
The figure added.
They will wait until you and Lord Verminard have flown to Qualinesti. Then they will free the children and escape into the mountains before you return. That seems to be a plan equal to their intelligence. Do not worry about Verminard. I will see he learns of this when I am ready for him to learn of it. Much greater matters are brewing, much greater. Now, listen closely. A prisoner was brought in today by that imbecile Turda.
Pyros paused, his eyes glowing. His voice dropped to a hissing whisper.
It is he. The one we seek.
The figure stared in astonishment.
Are you certain? Of course.
Pyros snarled viciously.
I see this man in my dreams. He is here within my grasp. When all of Kryn is searching for him, I have found him.
You will inform her Dark Majesty?
No. I dare not trust a messenger. I must deliver this man in person, but I cannot leave now. Verminard cannot deal with Qualinesti alone, even if the war is just a ruse. We must keep up appearances, and the world will be better for the absence of elves anyway. I will take the Everman to the Queen when time permits. So why tell me? The figure asked, an edge in his voice. Because you must keep him safe.
Pyros shifted his great bulk into a more comfortable position. His plans were coming together rapidly now.
It is a measure of her Dark Majesty's power that the cleric of Mishikal and the man of the green gemstone arrive together within my reach. I will allow Verminard the pleasure of dealing with the cleric and her friends tomorrow. In fact,
Pyros' eyes gleamed.
This may work out quite well. We can remove the green gemstone man in the confusion, and Verminard will know nothing. When the slaves attack, you must find the green gemstone man, bring him back here, and hide him in the lower chambers. When the humans have all been destroyed, and the army has wiped out Qualinesti, I will deliver him to my Dark Queen. I understand.
The figure bowed again.
And my reward will be all you deserve. Now, leave me.
The man cast the hood up over his head and withdrew. Pyros folded his wings and, curling his great body around with the huge tail up over his snout, he lay, staring into the darkness. The only sound that could be heard was Seston's pitiful weeping.
Are you all right?
Fizban asked Tasselhoff gently, as they sat crouched by the balcony, afraid to move. It was pitch dark, Fizban having overturned a vase on the highly indignant buffalo flame.
Yes,
Tass said dully.
I'm sorry I choked like that. I couldn't help myself. Even though I expected it, sort of. It's still hard to realize someone you know could betray you. Do you think the dragon heard me?
I couldn't say, Fizban sighed.
The question is, what do we do now? I don't know, Tass said miserably. I'm not supposed to be the one that thinks. I just come along for the fun. We can't warn Tanis and the others because we don't know where they are. And if we start wandering around looking for them, we might get caught and only make things worse. He put his chin in his hand. You know, he said with unusual somberness, I asked my father once why Kenders were little, why we weren't big like humans and elves. I really wanted to be big, he said softly. And for a moment, he was quiet. What did your father say? Asked Fizban gently. He said Kenders were small because we were meant to do small things. If you look at all the big things in the world closely, he said, you'll see that they're really made up of small things all joined together. That big dragon down there comes to nothing but tiny drops of blood, maybe. It's the small things that make the difference. Very wise, your father. Yes. Tass brushed his hand across his eyes. I haven't seen him in a long time. The Kender's pointed chin jutted forward, his lips tightened. His father, if he had seen him, would not have known this small, resolute person for his son. We'll leave the big things to the others, Tass announced finally. They've got Tanis and Sturm and Gold Moon. They'll manage. We'll do the small thing, even if it doesn't seem very important. We're going to rescue Sestum. Chapter 13. Questions. No answers. Fizban's hat. I heard something, Tanis, and I went to investigate, Eben said, his mouth set in a firm line. I looked outside the cell door I was guarding, and I saw a Draconian crouched there, listening. I crept out, got it in a chokehold, then a second one jumped me. I knifed it, then took off after the first. I caught it and knocked it out, then decided I'd better get back here. The companions had returned to the cells to find both Gilfanas and Eben waiting for them. Tanis had Marita keep the women busy in a far corner, while he questioned the two about their absence. Eben's story appeared true. Tanis had seen the bodies of the Draconians as he returned to the prison, and Eben had certainly been in a fight. His clothes were torn, blood trickled from a cut on his cheek. Tika got a relatively clean cloth from one of the women and began washing the cut. He saved our lives, Tanis, she snapped. I think you'd be grateful instead of glaring at him as if he'd stabbed your best friend. No, Tika, Eben said gently. Tanis is right to ask. It did look suspicious, I admit, but I have nothing to hide. Catching hold of her hand, he kissed her fingertips. Tika flushed and dipped the cloth in water, raising it to his cheek again. Karen, watching, scowled. What about you, Gilfanas? The warrior asked abruptly. Why did you leave? Do not question me, the elf said sullenly. You don't want to know. Know what? Tanis said sternly. Why did you leave? Leave him alone, Lorana cried, going to her brother's side. Gilfanas's almond eyes flashed as he glanced at them. His face was drawn and pale. This is important, Lorana.
Are you okay, Dobby?
Where did you go, Gilfanas? Remember, I warned you. Gilfanas's eyes shifted to Racer. I returned to see if our mage was really as exhausted as he said. He must not have been. He was gone. Karaman stood up, his fists clenched, his face distorted with anger. Sturm grabbed hold of him and shoved him backwards as Riverwind stepped in front of Gilfanas. All have a right to speak, and all have a right to respond in their own defense. The plainsman said in his deep voice, The elf has spoken. Let us hear from your brother. Why should I speak? Raceland whispered harshly.
his voice soft and lethal with hate.
None of you trusts me, so why should you believe me? I refuse to answer. And you may think as you choose. If you believe I am a traitor, kill me now. I will not stop you.
He began to cough.
You'll have to kill me too.
Karaman said in a choked voice. He led his brother back to his bed. Tanis felt sick.
Double watches all night. No, not you, Evan. Stern, you and Flint first.
Riverwind and I'll take the second. Tanis slumped down on the floor, his head on his arms.
We've been betrayed,
he thought. One of those three is a traitor, and has been all along.
The guards might come at any moment. Or perhaps Verminard was more subtle, someone trapped to catch us all.
Then Tanis saw it all with sickening clarity. Of course, Verminard would use the revolt as an excuse to kill the hostages and the cleric. He could always get more slaves, who would have a horrible example before their eyes of what happened to those who disobeyed him. This plan, Gilfanas's plan, played right into his hands.
We should abandon it.
Tanis thought wildly. Then he forced himself to calm down. No, the people were too excited. Following Illistan's miraculous healing and his announced determination to study these ancient gods, the people had hope. They believed that the gods had truly come back to them. But Tanis had seen the other High Seekers look at Illistan, jealously. He knew that, though they made a show of supporting the new leader, given time they would try to subvert him. Perhaps, even now, they were moving among the people, spreading doubt. If we backed out now, they'd never trust us again, Tanis thought. We must go ahead, no matter how great the risk.
Besides, perhaps he was wrong. Maybe there was no traitor.
Hoping, he fell into a fitful sleep. The night passed in silence. Dawn filtered through the gaping hole in the tower of the fortress. Tas blinked, then sat up, rubbing his eyes, wondering for a moment where he was.
I'm in a big room,
he thought, staring up at a high ceiling that had a hole cut in it to allow the dragon access to the outside.
There are two other doors besides the one Fizban and I came through last night. Fizban, the dragon!
Tas groaned, remembering. He hadn't meant to fall asleep. He and Fizban had only been waiting until the dragon slept to rescue Seskin. Now it was morning. Perhaps it was too late. Fearful, Makender crept to the balcony and peered over the edge. No. He sighed in relief. The dragon was asleep. Seskin slept too, worn out with fear. Now was their chance. Tasselhoff crawled back to the mage.
Hold on,
he whispered.
wake up.
He shook him.
What? Who? Fire!
The mage sat up, peering around blearily.
Where? Run for the exits.
No, not a fire. Tas sighed.
It's morning. Here's your hat.
He handed it to the magician, who was groping around, searching for it.
What happened to the puffball of light?
Humph. Fizban sniffed.
I sent it back. Kept me awake, shining in my eyes. We were supposed to stay awake, remember?
Tas said in exasperation.
Rescue Sistan from the dragon? How were we going to do that?
Fizban asked eagerly.
You were the one with the plan.
I was? Here. The old magician blinked.
Is it a good one? You didn't tell me.
Tas nearly shouted. Then he calmed down.
All you said was that we had to rescue Seskin before breakfast, because Gully Dwarf might start looking more appetizing to a dragon who hadn't eaten in 12 hours.
That makes sense, Fizban conceded.
Are you sure I said it? Look,
said Tasselhoff patiently.
All we really need is a long rope to throw down to him. Can't you magic that up?
Rope?
Fizban glared at him, as if I'd stoop so low. That is an insult to one of my skill. Help me stand. Task helped the mage stand. I didn't mean to insult you, the Kender said. And I know there's nothing fancy about rope, and you are very skilled. It's just that... Oh, all right. Task gestured toward the balcony. Go ahead. I just hope we all survive. He muttered under his breath. I won't let you down, or Seston either, for that matter, Fizban promised, beaming. The two peeked over the balcony. Everything was as before. Seston lay in a corner. The dragon slept soundly. Fizban closed his eyes, concentrating. He murmured eerie words, then stretched his thin hand through the railing of the balcony and began to make a lifting motion. Tasselhoff, watching, felt his heart fly up in his throat. Stop, he gurgled. You've got the wrong one. Fizban's eyes flew open to see the red dragon, Pyros, slowly rising off the floor, his body still curled in sleep. Oh dear. The magician gasped, and quickly saying different words, he reversed the spell, lowering the dragon to the ground. Missed my aim, the mage said. Now I'm zeroed in. Let's try again. Tass heard the eerie words again. This time, Seston began to rise off the floor and, breath by breath, came level with the balcony. Fizban's face grew red with exertion. He's almost here. Keep going, Tass said, hopping up and down in excitement. Guided by Fizban's hand, Seston sailed peacefully over the balcony. He came to rest on the dusty floor, still asleep. Seston, Tass whispered, putting his hand over the gully dwarf's mouth so that he wouldn't yell. Seston! It's me, Tasselhoff. Wake up! The gully dwarf opened his eyes. His first thought was that Verminard had decided to feed him to a vicious Kender instead of the dragon. Then the gully dwarf recognized his friend and went limp with relief. You're safe, but don't say a word, the Kender warned. The dragon can still hear us. He was interrupted by a loud booming from below. The gully dwarf sat up in alarm. Shh, said Tass. Probably just the door into the dragon's lair. He hurried back to the balcony where Fizban was peering through the railing. What is it? The Dragon High Lord. Fizban pointed to the second level where Verminard stood on a ledge overlooking the dragon. Ember! Awaken! Verminard yelled down at the sleeping dragon. I have received reports of intruders. That cleric is here, inciting the slaves to rebellion. Pyros stirred and slowly opened his eyes, awakening from a disturbing dream in which he'd seen a gully dwarf fly. Shaking his giant head to clear away the sleep, he heard Verminard ranting about clerics. He yawned. So the Dragon High Lord had found out the cleric was in the fortress. Pyros supposed he'd have to deal with this now, after all. Do not trouble yourself, my lord, Pyros began, then stopped abruptly, staring at something very strange. Trouble myself, Verminard fumed. Why, He stopped too. The object at which both stared was drifting down through the air, gently as a feather. Fizban's hat. Tanis woke everyone in the darkest hour before dawn. Well, said Sturm, do we go ahead? We have no choice, Tanis said grimly, looking at the group. If one of you has betrayed us, then he must live with the knowledge that he has brought about the deaths of innocents. Verminard will kill not only us, but the hostages as well. I pray that there is no traitor. And so I'm going ahead with our plans. No one said anything, but each glanced sideways at the others, suspicion gnawing at all of them. When the women were awake, Tanis went over the plan again. My friends and I will sneak up to the children's room with Marita, disguised as the women who usually bring the children breakfast. We'll lead them to the courtyard. Tanis said quietly, "You must go about your business as you do every morning. When you are allowed into the exercise area, get the children and start moving immediately toward the mines. Your menfolk will handle the guards there, and you can escape safely into the mountains to the south. Do you understand?" The women nodded silently as they heard the sound of the guards approaching. "This is it," Tanis said softly. "Back to your work." The women scattered. Tanis beckoned to Tika and Lorana. "If we have been betrayed, you will both be in great danger. Since you'll be guarding the women," he began. "We'll all be in great danger," Lorana amended coldly. She hadn't slept all night. She knew that if she released the tight bands she had wrapped around her soul, fear would overwhelm her. Tanis saw none of this inner turmoil. He thought she appeared unusually pale and exceptionally beautiful this morning. A long-time campaigner himself, his preoccupation made him forget the terrors of a first battle. Clearing his throat, he said huskily, "Tika, take my advice. Keep your sword in your scabbard. You're less dangerous that way." Tika giggled and nodded nervously. "Go say goodbye to Karen," Tanis told her. Tika blushed crimson and, giving Tanis and Lorana a meaningful look, ran off. Tanis gazed at Lorana steadily for a moment and, for the first time, saw that her jaw muscles were clenched so tightly the tendons in her neck were stretched. He reached out to hold her, but she was stiff and cold as a Draconian's corpse. "You don't have to do this," Tanis said, releasing her. "This isn't your fight. Go to the mines with the other women." Lorana shook her head, waiting to speak until she was certain her voice was under control. "Tika is not trained for fighting. I am. No matter if it was ceremony." She smiled bitterly at Tanis's look of discomfiture. "I will do my part, Tanis." His human name came awkwardly to her lips. "Otherwise, you might think I am a traitor." "Lorana, please leave me," Tanis sighed. "I don't think Gilfanas is a traitor any more than you do. It's just... Damn it, there are so many lives at stake, Lorana. Can't you realize?" Feeling his hands on her arms shake, she looked up at him and saw the anguish and the fear in his own face, mirroring the fear she felt inside. Only his was not fear for himself. It was fear for others. She drew a deep breath. "I am sorry, Tanis," she said. "You are right. Look, the guards are here. It is time to go." She turned and walked away without looking back. It didn't occur to her until it was too late that Tanis might have been silently asking for comfort himself. Marita and Gold Moon led the companions up a flight of narrow stairs to the first level. The Draconian guards didn't accompany them, saying something about special duty. Tanis asked Marita if that was usual, and she shook her head, her face worried. They had no choice but to go on. 6 gully dwarves trailed after them, carrying heavy pots of what smelled like oatmeal. They paid little attention to the women until Karaman stumbled over his skirt, climbing the stairs, and fell to his knees, uttering a very unladylike oath. The gully dwarf's eyes opened wide. "Don't even squeak," Flint said, whirling around to face them, a knife flashing in his hand. The gully dwarves cowered against the wall, shaking their heads frantically, the pots clattering. The companions reached the top of the stairs and stopped. "We crossed this hall to the door," Marita pointed. "Oh no!" She grasped Tanis's arm. There's a guard on the door. It's never guarded.
Hush. It could be coincidence, Tanis said reassuringly, although he knew it wasn't. Let's keep on as we planned. Marita nodded fearfully and walked across the hall. Gods. Tanis turned to Stern. Be ready. Remember, quick and deadly. No noise. According to Gilthanus's map, the playroom was separated from the children's sleeping quarters by 2 rooms. The first was a storeroom, which Marita reported was lined with shelves containing toys and clothing and other items. A tunnel ran through this room to the second, the room that housed the dragon, Flamestrike.
Poor thing.
Marita had said when discussing the plan with Tanis.
She is as much a prisoner as we are. The Dragon High Lord never allows her out. I think they're afraid she'll wander off. They've even built a tunnel through the storeroom, too small for her to fit through. Not that she wants to get out, but I think she might like to watch the children play.
Tanis regarded Marita dubiously, wondering if they might encounter a dragon very different from the mad, feeble creature she described. Beyond the dragon's lair was the room where the children slept. This was the room they would have to enter, to wake the children and lead them outdoors. The playroom connected directly with the courtyard through a huge door locked with a great oaken beam.
More to keep the dragon in than us,
Marita stated. It must be just about dawning, Tanis thought, as they emerged from the stairwell and turned toward the playroom. The torchlight cast their shadows ahead of them. Paxtharkus was quiet, deathly quiet. Too quiet for a fortress preparing for war. 4 Draconian guards stood huddled together, talking at the doorway to the playroom. Their conversation broke off as they saw the women approach. Gold Moon and Marita walked in front. Gold Moon's hood was drawn back, her hair glimmering in the torchlight. Directly behind Gold Moon came Riverwind. Bent over a staff, the plainsman was practically walking on his knees. Caraman and Raceland followed, the mage staying close to his brother. Then Eben and Gilthanus. All the traitors together, as Raceland had sarcastically observed. Flint brought up the rear, turning occasionally to glower at the panic-stricken gully dwarves. You're early this morning, a Draconian growled. The women clustered like chickens in a half-circle around the guards and stood, waiting patiently to be allowed inside.
It smells of thunder, Marita said sharply. I want the children to have their exercise before the storm hits. And what are you doing here? The door is never guarded. You'll frighten the children.
One of the Draconians made some comment in their harsh language, and 2 of the others grinned, showing rows of pointed teeth. The spokesman only snarled. Lord Permanard's command. He and Ember are gone this morning to finish the elves. We're ordered to search you before you enter. The Draconian's eyes fastened onto Gold Moon hungrily. That's going to be a pleasure, I'd say. For you, maybe, muttered another guard, staring at Sturm in disgust. I've never seen an uglier female in my life, and... Ugh! The creature slumped over, a dagger thrust deep into its ribs. The other 3 Draconians died within seconds. Caraman wrapped his hands around the neck of one. Eben hit his in the stomach, and Flint lobbed off its head with an axe as it fell. Tanis stabbed the leader through the heart with his sword. He started to let go of the weapon, expecting it to remain stuck in the creature's stony corpse. To his amazement, his new sword slid out of the stone carcass as easily as if it had been nothing more than goblin flesh. He had no time to ponder this strange occurrence. The gully dwarves, catching sight of the flash of steel, dropped their pots and ran wildly down the corridor. Never mind them. Tanis snapped at Flint. Into the playroom. Hurry! Stepping over the bodies, he flung the door open. If anyone finds these bodies, it'll be over,
Karaman said. It was over before we began, Sturm muttered angrily. We've been betrayed, so it's just a matter of time. Keep moving, Tanis said sharply, shutting the door behind them. Be very quiet, Marita whispered. Flamestrike generally sleeps soundly. If she does waken, act like women. She'll never recognize you. She's blind in one eye. The chill dawn light filtered in through tiny windows high above the floor, shining on a grim, cheerless playroom. A few
Weapon.
less playroom. A few well-used toys lay scattered about. There was no furniture. Karaman walked over to inspect the huge wooden beam barring the double doors that led to the courtyard outside. I can manage, he said. The big man appeared to lift the beam effortlessly, then set it against the wall and shoved on the door. Not locked from the outside, he reported. I guess they didn't expect us to get this far. Or perhaps Lord Verminard wants us out there, Tanis thought. He wondered if what the Draconian said was true. Had the Dragon High Lord and the dragon really gone, or were they... Angrily, he wrenched his mind back. It doesn't matter, he told himself. We have no choice. We must go on. Flint, stay here, he said. If anyone comes, warn us first, then fight. Flint nodded and took a position just inside the door leading to the corridor, first opening it a crack to see. The Draconian bodies had turned to dust on the floor. Marita took a torch from the wall. Lighting it, she led the companions through a dark archway into the tunnel leading to the dragon's lair. Fizban, your hat! Tass risked whispering. Too late. The old magician made a grab for it, but missed. Spies! Yelled Verminard in a rage, pointing up to the balcony. Capture them, Ember! I want them alive! Alive? The dragon repeated to himself. No, that could not be. Pyros recalled the strange sound he had heard last night, and he knew without a doubt that these spies had overheard him talking about the green gemstone man. Only a privileged few knew that dread secret, the great secret. The secret that would conquer the world for the Queen of Darkness. These spies must die, and the secret die with them. Pyros spread his wings and launched himself into the air, using his powerful back legs to propel himself from the floor with tremendous speed. This is it, thought Tasselhoff. Now we've done it. There's no escape this time. Just as he resigned himself to being cooked by a dragon, he heard the magician shout a single word of command, and a thick, unnatural darkness almost knocked the Kender over. Run! Panted Fizban, grabbing the Kender's hand and dragging Tass to his feet. Sexton! I've got him! Run! Tasselhoff ran. They flew out the door and into the gallery. Then he had no idea where he was going. He just kept hold of the old man and ran. Behind him, he could hear the sound of the dragon whooshing up out of his lair, and he heard the dragon's voice. So you are a magic user, are you, spy? Pyros shouted. We can't have you running around in the dark. You might get lost. Let me light your way. Tasselhoff heard a great intake of breath into a giant body. Then flames crackled and burned around him. The darkness vanished, driven away by the fire's flaring light, but
To his amazement, Tass wasn't touched by the flame. He looked at Fizban, hatless,